It is a wonderful honor to welcome Dr. Peter McCullough. He is a noted American cardiologist and one of the few brave souls who spoke out against the COVID mess of a policy that the US has made over the years. So, Dr. McCullough, thank you very much for joining the program.
It's an honor to join you. Thank you.
Okay, so I'd like to spend much of the time that we have to discuss the book that you co-authored with John Leake, titled The Courage to Face COVID-19. But first, I'd like to address your Wikipedia article, if you don't mind. The third sentence after addressing your job as well as your work history or your employment history, it says, from the beginnings of the COVID-19 pandemic, McCullough has promoted misinformation about COVID-19, its treatments, and mRNA vaccines. So your thoughts on that, if you will.
The Wikipedia editors had a change of heart somewhere around mid 2021. So I checked my Wikipedia page in 2021. Of course, the editors are anonymous and the individuals can't control their own biography. But up until midpoint of 2021, I was cited as one of the most published cardiologists and internists in my field of heart and kidney medicine. They mentioned that I had testified in the US Senate in November 19th of 2020, bringing the world the news that we had learned how to treat SARS-CoV-2 infection, prevent hospitalizations and deaths, our seminal publication in the American Journal of Medicine. So it was all good until the summer of 2021, and something happened at Wikipedia, and they started using propaganda terms like misinformation. There's no such thing as misinformation in science or in clinical medicine. There simply are observations that we make in data and multiple interpretive points of view. So the question on the table is, why did Wikipedia start propaganda operations mid-2021?
Of course. So going back to the beginning of the pandemic, what did you notice that was wrong in regards to the preparation process?
Well, the first thing I noticed, and I was completely unprepared, this caught me by surprise. The first thing I noticed is that the first response was not early treatment. All we heard about was personal protective equipment and then the use of the hospital and mechanical ventilators. Well, both using masking, social distancing, lockdown, and mechanical ventilators, those don't treat the problem. So it became apparent to me that there are two bad outcomes of SARS-CoV-2 infection: hospitalization and death. They're both bad outcomes. So the only way to prevent hospitalization and death is to apply treatment early. And what shocked me is that there were no governments talking about early treatment. There were no prominent medical institutions, doing randomized trials or developing early treatment protocols. And this went on for months as people unnecessarily were hospitalized, and sadly, almost all the deaths occurred in the hospital.
So before the emergence of the vaccine, and of course we can dispute the merits of the vaccine, what do you make of the merits of certain treatments like hydroxychloroquine and ivermectin, amongst other treatments?
I think some of the most impressive developments on early treatment actually start with SARS-CoV-2 infection in the nose and mouth. And those are nasal sprays and gargles. This is very important. The virus is in the nose and mouth for days, replicating before it invades the body. It makes sense that treatment must start locally in the nose and mouth. And yet there were no governments even investigating this, let alone promulgating any strategies. So Chowdhury and colleagues published a very impressive, large, prospective, blinded, randomized trial. And they demonstrated that dilute povidone iodine drops actually used in the eyes, nose, and mouth every 4 hours dramatically reduced PCR positivity within a few days, reduced severity of illness, need for oxygen, hospitalization, and death. You know, when these types of papers move forward, this should have been international press releases. Then we had data come forward by Baumforth and colleagues Again, another very high quality prospective randomized trial showing xylitol-based nasal sprays markedly reduced the chances of getting COVID-19. They were better than a vaccine in terms of risk reduction. So these forms of nasal sprays and gargles were absolutely a major advance. They were completely ignored. Next in line was the use of aspirin, which was critical for reducing blood clots. No mention. Vitamin D. Every single data point on vitamin D was positive. It appeared to have an antiviral effect. Vitamin C, quercetin, zinc, and then the use of famotidine. Famotidine is over the counter in the United States. It's an antihistamine, antacid. A large study from University of Virginia, Mura and colleagues demonstrated dramatic reductions in need for oxygenation and hospitalization with famotidine. So we had a very good over-the-counter bundle. It's called the OTC bundle, the McCullough protocol, completely ignored. That's actually before we get to oral drugs. So there was an unnecessary focus on hydroxychloroquine, which now in over 400 studies, it had a modest effect in reducing the intensity and severity of the illness. And so hydroxychloroquine was fine. It was one of many choices that we could make. Ivermectin had stronger data. Ivermectin now in dozens of randomized trials reduced mortality. In fact, the most impressive study was the ICON study done in the United States, reduced mortality for inpatients by 50%. And then we move on. It was 2 years before the United States, we got Paxlovid, which is the combination of nirmatrelvir and ritonavir. And that had a modest effect. We had favipiravir used in Russia and China, and lastly molnupiravir. So that rounded out the oral antivirals. But we saw all of them undermined by governments, and it didn't stop there. There were monoclonal antibodies, which were always safe and effective, high-tech, expensive. We had bought enough to treat every American. And in fact, they were sequentially taken off the market after a few weeks or a few months, one by one, despite them being safe and effective. We saw undermining of colchicine, very, very important drug. There's 39 meta-analyses of individual studies showing colchicine had a huge effect in reducing the risk of hospitalization and death. And again, it was undermined, no mention. Proper use of corticosteroids like methylprednisolone, anticoagulants. All the components of the McCullough protocol were undermined because it appeared as if government agencies, and in our book, the biopharmaceutical complex, they had a singular approach, a singular goal, and it had nothing to do with treatment. It was all about mass vaccination.
Yes, I'm reminded of what happened in the AIDS pandemic. There was a recent movie, Dallas Buyers Club, with Matthew McConaughey, where he plays a character who starts a buyers club where they seek and purchase and distribute drugs that were alternative to the mainline institutionally sanctioned drug that would suppress HIV at the time, AZT. And of course, if you replace AZT with the COVID vaccine and the AIDS pandemic with the COVID pandemic, then we have history repeating itself. But of course, the common factor within the AIDS epidemic and the COVID pandemic is our, I guess, medicinal pope, Dr. Anthony Fauci. I wonder, have you had a chance to read his memoir yet?
Well, I've had a chance to read certainly Robert F. Kennedy's book, The Real Anthony Fauci. In fact, I'm frequently mentioned in that book, the most mentioned doctor in that book. And, I have to tell you, I disagree a bit with that interpretation through Dallas Buyers Club, as well as the RFK book. I was practicing medicine at the time when HIV presented itself to the medical community. I do not think Anthony Fauci was a prominent figure. He didn't influence me in using AZT or using other drugs. We quickly used other drugs to get people through these initial, the HIV syndrome and then these opportunistic infections. So I think what's happened is people have looked back in time and made Fauci bigger than life of what he was back then. He did emerge to become a very prominent figure in COVID, but not so much in HIV.
That's it. Okay. I've also had a chance to interview Dr. Robert Malone on this podcast, and he has raised some serious alarms in regards to how the mRNA technology is being used for the vaccine. So I wonder, to what extent do you share his concerns?
Messenger RNA in a paper by Lalani has been in by government agencies and the military and the pharmaceutical companies since 1985. There's no single inventor of messenger RNA. There actually really aren't any significant contributors because there are so many patents. So over 9,000 patents. Carrico and Wiseman have gotten the most credit for pseudouridination of messenger RNA. But the broad approach, and I think the pair of people that's probably would have the greatest claim of, quote, inventing messenger RNA is Agar Sahin and his wife, who work for BioNTech. But all the big significant inventors or developers of messenger RNA, they work for big companies. They're not independent people. And I can tell you that messenger RNA is so attractive because one on a computer screen can devise the code very quickly to code for any protein one wants to code for. So it's very desirable. So you could imagine someone who's deficient in insulin, like a type 1 diabetic, maybe messenger RNA to replace insulin could be an incredible advance, or in Fabry's disease, replacing the deficient enzyme there. It could be amazing. However, the use of messenger RNA for vaccines is a terrible idea. It is a disastrous molecular biological blunder. And it's amazing that so many people have a hand in this. And I can tell you, just as a doctor, if you would have asked me in 1985, should we design the genetic code to produce a lethal protein from a biosecurity lab out of China, or the lethal part of influenza virus, or dengue fever, or the dangerous part of respiratory syncytial virus? I would say no, we should never use messenger RNA to produce foreign proteins in the human body. Why? Foreign proteins are immediately recognized as not being human. They're expressed on cell surfaces. They can be circulatory in blood, and the body will always develop an autoimmune attack against foreign proteins. So I'm the only public figure in the world who published an op-ed in August of 2020. That's when all the other experts were saying, oh, messenger RNA vaccines are going to save us from the pandemic. And the title of my op-ed was The Great Gamble of the COVID-19 Vaccine Development Program. You're talking to the only one who saw this ahead of time. It's just for this simple fact that we cannot force the body to produce dangerous foreign proteins. I don't even think we can force the body to produce any foreign protein. And now a paper I've published with Laszlo Boros and colleagues demonstrated that the messenger RNA COVID-19 vaccines produce more than just the lethal Wuhan spike protein. They produce what's called frame-shifted proteins, probably a dozen of them, that incite more immune attack, autoimmune attack within the human body. So it's catastrophic. And all of those who claim to have a hand in messenger RNA development for vaccines are, in a sense, guilty of the worst biological development that humanity's ever seen.
So, how long do you believe it will take until the reckoning finally comes?
Well, let's take some historical precedents. In the mid-19th century, the very first smallpox vaccines were developed from the lymph of cows and horses, or even the serological material coming out of the skin of humans who have been vaccinated with smallpox. The smallpox vaccine, done over decades, was a disaster. It could not have been purified. It could not have been quantitated. And in fact, it was contaminated, of course, with staph and strep, tetanus, syphilis. People died unnecessarily of an ineffective smallpox vaccine over decades in the 19th century. And it led to the Anti-Vaccination League at the turn of the century, massive public protests, finally legislation in the UK to make it voluntary. Previously, people were forced into smallpox vaccination. And so finally, Sir Alfred Russel Wallace published a treatise, and he said the smallpox vaccines don't work. They're not safe, and he has 45 years of data to show it. I mean, this was impressive. So, I mean, for the early smallpox vaccine, it took over 50 years of reckoning. Now, if we move forward to another example, smoking. Around 1949, Rose and Hill pointed out that smoking almost certainly causes lung cancer, and that's where the Sir Austin Bradford Hill criteria of causality was published. Now, it went all the way to the 1968 Surgeon General's report that said, oh, maybe smoking can cause lung cancer. Doctors were, just like they were promoting the unsafe, ineffective smallpox vaccine, doctors in the mid-20th century were promoting smoking. They were in smoking commercials. Nurses were smoking. Hospital administrators, there was smoking in the operating room. It took decades from the time it was known that smoking causes lung cancer for doctors to have this moment of reckoning. Now, if we fast forward to the opioid crisis, where again, we're on about a 20-year cycle from the time Purdue Pharma intentionally developed highly addictive opioids and promoted them. Doctors were promoting them. Nurses were promoting them. In fact, nurses were the biggest promoters because of their adoption of pain as a fifth vital sign. It took 20 years before suddenly the medical community said, oh my gosh, we've done something horrible. We're going into 5 years on the COVID-19 vaccine campaign. I hope it doesn't take another 15 years before the medical community again realizes that they've done something horrible. This week in the New England Journal of Medicine, there is a brief communication. First author is Salmon, that states that we have a great need for vaccine safety research. Boy, is that late in coming and an understatement. We have a tidal wave of COVID-19 vaccine injuries, disabilities, and deaths, and the whole world knows it.
Yes. How would you judge the merits of natural immunity?
Natural immunity has always pulled us through every single viral illness. With COVID-19, through the Delta outbreak, natural immunity was nearly 100% protective. The Omicron variant, as it edged in December of 2021, it broke through natural immunity, but still natural immunity was partially protective. I think the best paper to cite is Chin and colleagues, New England Journal of Medicine, October of 2022. Those who had been through the Delta and Omicron outbreaks and had natural immunity with another infection, which we all can get, had a 0% risk of hospitalization and death, and it didn't matter if they took a vaccine or not. So natural immunity played a major role in the reduction in hospitalizations and deaths, which we saw through the pandemic. I'd say the other major factor was early treatment protocols. I just initiated one today on a patient who's never had COVID. That will prevent her hospitalization and death. And the third factor was having the virus evolve into much more milder strains. Omicron and the subvariants are far milder than the original Wuhan Alpha and Delta strains. But in no way did vaccination save millions of lives. That statement has been emanated as an assertion by Anthony Fauci, by House Select Committee subcommittee chair in Congress, multiple members of the Senate and Congress, multiple world leaders, and people in academic medicine have made the false claim that it's the vaccine that reduced death and saved millions of lives, and they always fail to mention natural immunity, early treatment, and the virus mutating to milder strains.
Yes. You've mentioned Robert Kennedy Jr. To what extent is his political voice, I guess, important or representative of those who, like you, are, I guess, a little bit suspicious to very, very much suspicious of the so-called consensus?
In the United States, it's important to have a third voice, whether it's Robert F. Kennedy or another independent voice, because in our case, we have the Democrat and Republican parties, and the two candidates, Biden and Trump respectively, they're identical on pandemic response. They both supported the vaccines. They both supported lockdown, social distancing, masking. In Biden's case, he promoted vaccine mandates. So both of our two front runners were a disaster on the pandemic. Neither one of them has admitted they've made any mistakes. Neither one of them has even wants to bring up the topic at any presidential rally or meeting or fundraiser. So we've got a big problem. So Robert F. Kennedy offers a different point of view, where he's clear that our government has made a disastrous series of mistakes on pandemic response. We've had lives lost with the infection, which never should have been lost. And now we've had people injured, disabled, and died with the vaccine. None of that needed to happen. And I can tell you, if I was in the White House as an advisor sitting here today, there would be millions of people alive now that sadly have lost their lives because they didn't follow the right approach.
Now, what is the connection between the big pharmaceutical companies and the major institutions of public health, say the NIH or the WHO?
In our book, Courage to Face COVID-19, we actually coined a term, the biopharmaceutical complex. And there we indicate that there is now a very intricate syndicate that's formed. At the top may be the World Economic Forum, the Wellcome Trust, Rockefeller Foundation, Gates Foundation, vaccine incubators like CEPI, the Coalition for Epidemic Preparedness and Innovation, founded by Gates and WEF. The pharmaceutical companies are suppliers. These various forms of organizations invest in them, like Sanofi, CureVac, BioNTech, Moderna, Pfizer, AstraZeneca. They are all intricately working as a syndicate. And very importantly, they've co-opted the regulatory agencies. So we're talking about the CDC, the NIH, the FDA, the MHRA in UK, TGA in Australia, SAFRA in South Africa, and the EMA in Europe. And what I mean by this is that the people working at the regulatory agencies, they're actually getting their next job in the biopharmaceutical complex. So they are accruing favor for these companies and these approvals, turning a blind eye to safety because they know they're going to be rewarded with the next job. And we have 9 out of the 10 last FDA commissioners take a job in the biopharmaceutical complex. We've had the top public health officials in the UK and Denmark just go work directly for Moderna. We've had a former FDA commissioner work for Flagship, the venture capital firm for Moderna. We've even had people within the White House, including Rick Bright, who worked to block the use of hydroxychloroquine, promote the vaccine agenda. He's taken a job with the Rockefeller Foundation. So I think we have ample evidence that the biopharmaceutical complex is working with budgets of billions, if not trillions of dollars, and they're running the table now with one infectious disease threat after another, a massive campaign to, in each and every case, lead the world's population to mass vaccination as the only solution.
Of course, the motto across the COVID pandemic is trust the science, which is a grammatical error because there shouldn't be a "the" in front of science. I guess throughout all this process, how has your definition or view of science and that process changed?
I'm one of the most published scientists and physicians in the world in history. In my area of heart and kidney disease, I have more National Library citations than virtually anyone you're ever going to talk to. So science is a process. Science is a process that myself and colleagues use the scientific method to test hypotheses and help advance the field. We make observations, and in my field, we use induction. Other fields like engineering use deduction, but we use inductive inferential reasoning to arrive at our conclusions. So science is not an edifice. It's not a big book. No one holds science and someone else is relegated to anti-science. In fact, the word science, and particularly anti-science, has become propagandized. So there are 6 propaganda terms your listeners should always immediately recognize. They should never utilize them against anyone, because propaganda terms are used to establish a power dynamic of one person over the other. These propaganda terms, which were used extensively in Nazi Germany, now used today by government agencies, the pharmaceutical industry, and the medical orthodoxy. These propaganda terms are misinformation, disinformation, malinformation, anti-science, anti-vaxxer, and conspiracy theorist. I don't use those terms. They don't have any role in the English lexicon or in proper scientific discourse. Anyone using these terms is attempting to gain power over someone else.
Well, just to assure you, unless used in context or quotations, those words do not enter my dictionary, at least when I'm doing this program.
Good. Well, listen, we're going to have to close it out here. It's been so nice to talk to you. I just want to encourage your listeners to follow me. I've done considerable work over the course of the pandemic. So go to my website, petermcculloughmd.com. That'll take you everywhere. My podcast is America Out Loud Talk Radio, McCullough Report, 2 p.m. Eastern every Saturday and Sunday. Then on the podcast circuit after that. My Substack, Courageous Discourse Substack, the leading medical Substack out there. Late-breaking clinical trials, abstracts, videos, interviews, and of course my book, Courage to Face COVID, preventing hospitalizations and deaths while battling the pharmaceutical complex. Go to couragetofacecovid.com.
All right. Well, on that note, thank you very much, Dr. Peter McCullough, for joining the show.